The collective had a word for humans that didn't translate cleanly into any Earth language. The closest approximation, if you fed it through a tertiary linguistic interpreter and accepted a reasonable margin of error, came out somewhere between salvageable and correctable. The kind of word you used for a machine that wasn't functioning at optimal capacity. The kind of word that arrived attached to a recommendation form, filed in triplicate, processed through 3 administrative levels by people who believed, with complete sincerity, that they were performing a service. Kale Davin didn't know that word existed the morning they arrived in Saranath, and it wouldn't have changed anything if he had. That was probably the thing the collective kept failing to account for. He was 41 years old, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 days, and the particular kind of tiredness that lives specifically behind the eyes and does not respond to sleep or vacation or changes of scenery or anything else you might try against it. He'd been a correspondent once. Real work? Boots-on-ground documentary journalism in 3 active conflict zones, 2 humanitarian disasters that hadn't resolved into anything the international community was comfortable calling a success, and one historically uncomfortable political summit on a moon colony that had nearly gotten him deported for the crime of asking follow-up questions. Now, he wrote speculative cultural essays for a mid-tier interstellar affairs journal that paid in delayed credits, described his voice as bold when they meant occasionally insubordinate, and had recently, with apparent sincerity, suggested he might benefit from what they called softening his editorial posture. He'd been thinking about that phrase for 6 weeks, and still couldn't decide if it made him want to laugh or quit, or both in sequence. His wife, Sarah, had found the listing. She'd shown him the brochure on her tablet at breakfast, holding it across the kitchen table with the presentation of someone who had already made a decision and was now in the process of communicating it rather than negotiating it. He remembered the way the light caught her face as she scrolled, the pale blue screen glow, making her look younger than 40, making her look like the woman who'd sat across from him in a cramped cafe on Titan Station 17 years ago and laughed at something he said before she even knew him well enough to decide if he was funny. She still had that laugh. He'd been chasing it throughout their marriage, not always successfully, not always understanding that the chasing was sometimes itself the problem. Saranath Residential Zone, she read aloud, in the carefully neutral voice she used when presenting something she expected him to resist. Administered by the Collective Harmony Directive, full biosphere integration, human populations fully accommodated and supported. Rated the most peaceful settled community in Quadrant 7, 3 years running. She looked up from the tablet. It's in our price range. Everything in our price range has something wrong with it. The pictures are beautiful. Brochures are supposed to have beautiful pictures. That's what distinguishes them from photographs. Kale. She set the tablet down with the precise, deliberate placement that meant she was being patient with him and finding it expensive. We need a change. We both know it. This, she gestured at the apartment, at the noise from the transport hub bleeding through the walls at 6 in the morning, like a transmission from a world that had no interest in their rest, at the stack of papers on his desk that he was calling pending correspondence, and which was actually rejection letters, at the general shape of their life, recently, which had the quality of something technically operational, but not quite going anywhere. This isn't working. We're not working. Not the way we should be. He hadn't argued. He didn't have the energy, and she wasn't wrong. The apartment had started to feel like a container that no longer fit either of them. Their conversations had shortened, not from hostility, but from the specific exhaustion of 2 people who love each other, being ground down separately and not quite managing to share the load. He missed her. That was the strange and clarifying thing. He missed her while she was in the same room, and that was a distance he didn't know how to close from the inside of it. So they packed, sold the furniture that wasn't worth shipping. Kale donated 3 boxes of research materials to a university archive and felt only a small, survivable grief about it. The grief of giving away a past version of yourself, uncomfortable but not catastrophic, the necessary cost of continuing. Cess wrapped her art equipment in archival foam and labeled every box in her careful architectural handwriting, color-coded by medium and fragility, and he stood in the doorway watching her do it with a feeling he couldn't entirely name. Not sadness exactly, more like the sensation of standing at a threshold and being genuinely unable to tell, from where you were standing, whether the room on the other side was better or worse than the one you were leaving. They took a transit vessel to Quadrant 7. 30 hours. They spent most of it in the companionable near silence of 2 people who had been together long enough that silence was not a distance, but a form of company. They read separately and occasionally pointed things out through the windows and ate terrible meal-pack food and complained about it in the mild, affectionate way of people for whom even complaining is a kind of warmth. He watched her sleep for an hour in the transit bunk and thought, this is what I am protecting. This specific, real, difficult, irreplaceable thing. Saraneth came up on the long-range viewer as they approached. A green and gold crescent of terraformed land on the inner rim of a settled moon, clean atmospheric shimmer around it, dotted with what looked from altitude like carefully clustered communities of low white buildings and long irrigated fields and green spaces that had been designed by someone with very precise ideas about what green spaces should look like. It looked, Kale thought, exactly like the brochure. He should have recognized that as a warning sign. Things that look exactly like their own advertisement rarely turn out to be anything worth trusting. The transport set them down at the arrival platform, and the first thing Kale noticed was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet. He knew what peaceful quiet felt like, had found it in remote field assignments, and on mountain trails, and in the specific hush of an archive at midnight when the ventilation system was the only sound in the building. This was different. This quiet felt applied, like a coat of paint over a surface that hadn't been properly prepared first. The kind of quiet that was actually the absence of certain specific sounds that should have been present and weren't. The arrival official was a collective-aligned human, third-generation integrated, with the smooth and careful effect of someone who had spent a very long time learning to perform contentment with complete technical fidelity. She smiled at them with her whole face. All the muscles that were supposed to be involved, and several that usually weren't, and handed them a welcome packet in a pale gold envelope that matched the brochure's color palette exactly. Your residential unit is pre-prepared, she said. Orientation begins tomorrow morning. Your neighborhood liaison has already arranged an introduction gathering for this evening, if you're feeling up to it. We just got off a 30-hour transit, KL said. Of course! No pressure at all. Rest first. The community will be here whenever you're ready. The smile maintained its precise dimensions. We are so glad you chose Saraneth. He noticed, as she turned to help the next arrivals, that she didn't make a single unnecessary movement. Not one. No adjustment of clothing, no idle gesture, no small unconscious physical habit. She moved between points with the economy of something that had been very thoroughly optimized, and the effect was not unpleasant, but was, he chose the word carefully even inside his own head, wrong in the way that a photograph of a smile is, wrong, technically accurate, missing the animating thing underneath. Their new home was a low white structure at the end of a pleasant curving street, lined with flowering plants that produced a smell somewhere between jasmine and cold mineral water. The interior was clean and well lit and completely, immaculately arranged, as though someone had decided in advance exactly where everything should be, and then placed it there with a level of care that approached ceremony. Everything matched. Everything was in proportion. Everything was exactly where it should be, according to someone's very specific and definitive idea of where things belonged. It's nice, Sarah said, standing in the main room, turning slowly. It's very nice. You're doing the voice. What voice? The one where you're being polite about something you're actually suspicious of. You've been doing it since we touched down. He almost said something deflecting. Instead, he said, honestly, I'm watching. We'll see. And because it was honest, she accepted it without pushing and began deciding where her art equipment would live. The introduction gathering was 3 days after arrival. They'd been more tired than expected from the transit and needed those first days to simply inhabit the new space. Kale walked the neighborhood alone each morning before Sarah was up, hands in his pockets, noticing things with the trained, patient attention he'd spent 20 years developing. The lawns were all the same depth of green. People nodded when he passed, but rarely stopped unless he initiated. The women who gathered outside the community center on Tuesday afternoons lowered their voices when he came near, their eyes tracking him with something that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't comfortable, the eyes of people assessing something they weren't sure how to categorize. The men were the thing that stayed with him. He saw several of them during those first days, moving between houses, tending gardens, performing the ordinary activities of neighborhood life. They were all perfectly pleasant when he exchanged a word. Perfectly pleasant in a way that felt, with each interaction, less like a personality and more like a surface, a door with no handle on the inside, well-painted, correctly proportioned, opening for nothing you couldn't explain through standard mechanisms. They spoke in full, even sentences. They smiled at appropriate intervals. They expressed satisfaction with their daily activities, with the measured, clean enthusiasm of a mission statement that had been workshopped down to its safest version. They never complained. Not the small, mutual, companionable kind of complaining that functions as social bonding between adults who have decided to trust each other. They never seemed distracted, never had that slightly elsewhere quality of people whose minds are half on something they're still working through. They had none of the difficult, specific, individual quality of men who were living their actual lives, that simmering, constantly attending quality of people who always have something they're not done with yet. He mentioned this to Sarah over dinner one evening, choosing words carefully because he was aware that what he was describing could sound, even to him, like a man who was suspicious of other men for being happy. Maybe they're just content, she said, genuinely offering the alternative. Content is one thing. I'm familiar with content. This is something else. It's like they've been simplified. Simplified how? Like someone took something complicated and removed everything that was inconvenient. He set down his fork. I'm going to try to make a real friend here, not a polite acquaintance. Someone who'll actually talk. I want to see if there's any real depth to find. He found Ren Hayes 2 days later. Ren was the only man in the neighborhood who looked like he'd been assembled from a rough description by someone doing their enthusiastic best. He was tall in a way that seemed to daily surprise him, perpetually reaching for shelves calibrated for someone shorter, with the long-limbed, slightly impractical quality of someone who had never quite finished adapting to his own height. He had the kind of laugh that startled birds and made children look up from what they were doing. He kept his front garden in cheerful rebellion against the neighborhood aesthetic. Things planted in the wrong places for reasons that clearly made personal sense to him, a sculptural project of salvaged copper wire and weathered stone occupying the center of what was supposed to be a lawn, 2 mismatched chairs on the porch that had obviously been chosen because he liked them individually, not because they went together. Kale had been walking past on a Tuesday morning when Ren dropped an entire tray of seedlings off his porch railing. The tray hit the boards, the seedlings went in 4 directions, and Ren surveyed the result briefly, and then deployed a sequence of profanity that was both comprehensive and inventive in ways suggesting genuine experience with disappointment. Kale laughed. He couldn't help it. Ren looked up with dirt on both hands and his dignity completely absent and grinned with the specific ease of a person who has stopped worrying about whether anyone is watching. I've been meaning to redistribute those anyway, he said. Give them more of a challenge. They talked for 2 hours on that porch. Not surface pleasantries, the real things underneath, the kind that happen when 2 people decide more or less simultaneously that the other is worth the effort of actual honesty. They talked about work that hadn't gone the way they'd hoped, about the specific texture of being 40, and trying to work out whether the second half of life would improve on the first or simply repeat its themes in lower light, about the minor and major failures of the past decade, reviewed without excessive defensiveness, but also without the false equanimity of people who have made their peace with things they actually haven't. Ren was a woodworker and sometime composer. He said sometime with the precise self-deprecation of someone who meant seriously but without recognition, who had come to Saranath 6 months ago with his partner Lena because she'd wanted proximity to the collective integration research, services the zone offered for her academic work. He'd come because she was happy and he'd had no strong reason to object. Do you like it here? Kale asked. Ren's expression shifted, not dramatically. A brief passage through something that wasn't quite doubt and wasn't quite discomfort, but was in the neighborhood of both, like a cloud crossing an otherwise clear sky. Mostly, he said. Quiet helps the work. I like Lena being settled. He paused, looking at the scattered seedlings he still hadn't picked up. Some of the men here, though, I can't quite say what's off about them. There's nothing you can point to exactly. They're fine people. They're just simplified, Kale said. Ren looked at him with a sharpness that hadn't been there a moment before, a recognition. Yeah, he said quietly. That's exactly the word. The introduction gathering happened at the community hall, a long, gracious building with walls the color of aged paper and windows designed to distribute light evenly at every hour. 40 people, the social formations of an established community. Kale moved through it with his drink and observed. 2 people stood out from the rest. Mira Voss was in her early 60s, white hair drawn back with architectural precision, with a way of occupying space that communicated decades of unquestioned authority. Not the aggressive kind, but the more dangerous kind, the kind that has operated so long without meaningful resistance that it has genuinely forgotten what resistance looks like. She headed the Harmony Directive's local coordinating committee. When she spoke, she did so with the calibrated certainty of someone who had stopped some time ago, seriously entertaining the possibility of being wrong. She assessed KL in the first few seconds of their introduction, and the assessment felt thorough in a way that left him with the mild, uncomfortable certainty of having been filed under a category she'd already prepared. Dr. Fenbrail was different. Early 40s, with a scientist's specific, constantly processing quality, the kind of eyes that are always quietly running, multiple analyses simultaneously. She crossed the room to introduce herself with the ease of someone who had already decided she found him interesting and was simply acting on that information. The introduction had the quality of a conversation already partway through. "You're the writer," she said. "Was trying to be again. What kind? The kind that goes and looks at things and writes about what was actually there." Her expression moved. Something precise and careful shifted slightly. "That must require a certain tolerance," she said slowly, "for finding things you'd rather not have found. Occupational hazard." "Yes," she said softly, as though the words had a meaning for her that went beyond their surface. "Yes, I imagine it would be." She was called away before he could follow it. He watched her go and filed her under things to revisit. The next 3 weeks established a rhythm that was pleasant on the surface and faintly, persistently wrong underneath in a way that wouldn't be argued away. Sarah settled into Serenith with the ease of someone who had been exhausted in their previous life and was genuinely grateful for respite. She made friends quickly, a sculptor 2 blocks over with a genuine sense of humor, a community planner named Dara who was warm and intellectually generous, a small group of women whose Thursday morning conversations had the easy, honest quality of people who actually liked each other. She was laughing more, sleeping better. The tension that had been in her shoulders for 2 years was easing. He was glad for this, and simultaneously aware that his own unease was, if anything, increasing. Ren had begun to change. Gradual enough that each individual step was rationalizable. The mismatched chairs on the porch replaced by 2 matching ones. The copper sculpture gone. Lena had thought it cluttered the space. The composition he'd been working on, the one he'd described with real specific technical enthusiasm, set aside, Lena felt the sound might disturb the neighbors. He agreed she was probably right. The voice he said these things in was the problem. The words were fine. The voice had the even, unconcerned quality of someone reading from a text that had been pre-cleared of anything inflammatory. Kale sat on his porch one evening and thought about Ren's composition, about the way Ren had described the theoretical framework in those early weeks. Layered dissonance that resolved eventually into something complex, a resolution that required you to reconsider what you'd been hearing from the beginning. Ren had transferred a 20-minute recording of the work in progress to Kale's reader as a reference during one of those conversations. Kale still had it. He pulled up everything publicly available about the Stepford Harmony Institute, a sleek facility at the zone's eastern boundary, offering, according to its clean signage, integrated wellness and behavioral alignment services for families in transition. The literature was impeccable. Every sentence said the right thing. Harmony, integration, optimal functioning, collaborative wellness. The language was smooth because it had been tested against resistance and refined until resistance was minimized. The Institute's director was listed as Coordinator Voss. No photograph, no biographical details beyond a list of collective certifications. Mira Voss. He filed the connection and kept reading. 3 days later, Ren told him he'd been thinking about visiting the Institute for a consultation. Lena had suggested it. Some of the other men had been and found it helpful. He mentioned this in the same tone he'd recently developed for everything. Even unconcerned, the tone of a person who has arrived somewhere peaceful and found no reason to leave. Kale went to find Dr. Fen Braille. She was at the Community Research Annex in a small office that looked like someone had tipped a library onto every available surface and then accepted the aftermath as permanent. She had a cup of cold tea and the focused, faintly distracted air of someone who had been in the building since well before it was officially open. Kale sat across from her and told her what he'd observed, all of it without editorializing. He watched her face while he spoke and saw, underneath the careful neutrality she'd maintained since their first conversation, something that was working hard to not be relief. When he finished, she set the cold tea down. "How much do you know about the Collective Harma Directive's integration protocols for human settler populations?" "Only what's in the public documentation." "The public documentation," she said, "leaves out the part that matters." She unlocked a secondary drive with her biometric and turned the screen toward him. The Institute's treatment architecture is derived from collective behavioral optimization protocols developed for non-human species over several decades. They were adapted, I use the word loosely, for human neurology approximately 8 years ago, when the collective began formally administering settled human zones. She paused. They work. That's the problem. They work in the sense that a blade works. The question isn't whether the cut is clean. It's what is being cut, and who decided to cut it, and on what authority. The screen showed a layered neurological comparison, before and after profiles from the Institute's full treatment program. The before profiles were complex, irregular, lit up in the specific pattern of a mind running multiple processes, strongly engaged in particular areas, the kind of interior architecture built by years of specific passions and difficult preoccupations and everything that makes a person themselves. The after profiles were smooth, uncomplicated in the way that a room is uncomplicated after everything that gave it character has been removed. The men who complete the full program are functional, Dr. Braille said. Cooperative. The marriages are measurably more stable by every metric the Institute tracks. There is no conflict. There is very little pain. She looked at the screen. There is also very little of whatever made each of them specifically who they were. The parts that were difficult, the obsessive, creative engagements, the sharp edges, the stubbornness, the passionate, specific preoccupations that their partners found inconvenient. Those are not suppressed. They are gone. The neurological infrastructure that supported them has been modified. It does not regenerate. The coldness he felt was not dramatic. It was the cold of putting a name to something you've been circling, and finding the name made it more real, not less. Does Mira Voss know this? Mira Voss designed this, without inflection, which made it land harder. She has been running versions of this program since the zone's founding. I believe she is a genuine true believer. I don't think she experiences this as cruelty. I think she understands human difficulty as a pathology and herself as someone who treats pathologies. The critical gap in her thinking is that she has never seriously engaged with the question of whether the patient gave meaningful consent. A pause. I have been engaging with that question for 3 years. It has not made me popular in this zone. You work here. I research here. My research has reached conclusions Voss finds profoundly inconvenient, and we are in what I would characterize as a deteriorating professional arrangement. She opened a drawer and removed a data crystal, small, heavier than expected. I have documentation, neurological profiles, intake procedures, consent forms that are technically signed but presented under conditions I consider coercive, in ways a collective regulatory review would be interested in. 3 years of this, she held it out. I have been waiting for someone who could use it. He took it, cool in his palm. How long before my neighbor Ren is past the point of meaningful recovery? If he enters the full program, 6 weeks, maybe 8, given that he's had partial exposure only. Earlier stages are more reversible. She looked at him directly. Don't waste the time you have. He didn't. The investigative work operated on 2 clocks simultaneously. He'd learned this 20 years ago, and the knowledge had cost him once, in a way he still carried. In a conflict zone story, he'd moved too fast, and sources he named were endangered before protections were established. He still carried that. It had made him more patient, more careful, more willing to hold the accumulation clock longer than was comfortable. He couldn't afford that patience now, but he couldn't discard it either. He had to hold both clocks and run. He worked at his desk during the days while Sarah was at her studio. He cross-referenced the collective's administrative documents, the zone charter filings, the Institute's registered treatment protocols, the founding documentation of the Harmony Directive. He built a map, annotated, precise, fully sourced, of what was documented, what was implied, and what was conspicuously absent. He found 3 prior residential zone programs with organizational lineage connecting to Voss's committee. 2 had been quietly dissolved after pattern of harm reviews. The 3rd was still operational in a remote sector and had generated 17 formal complaints over 5 years, each filed individually, each failing to reach the investigation threshold, because the threshold was designed to require coordinated evidence, and the system had provided no coordination mechanism. The complaints died in separate queues, unconnected, never accumulating into the critical mass that would trigger review. He photographed everything. He organized it into a structure navigable, without prior context. He encrypted a preliminary package and transmitted it to 2 journalists he trusted, with instructions not to open it unless they hadn't heard from him in 10 days. He talked to Gordon Hayes. Getting Gordon alone took 2 days of careful work. The man's schedule was managed in a way that was impossible to object to precisely because it was done with such impeccable consideration. always somehow with Lena present, always in context that made real conversation structurally unavailable. Kale finally caught him on an early perimeter walk, just the two of them on the path around the zone's eastern edge. Gordon listened to what Kale said with the smooth, cooperative affect he'd had for weeks, but when Kale mentioned the woodwork, the specific projects Gordon had described in those very first days, the joints and hand fits and pieces of real furniture with real weight, something happened in Gordon's eyes, brief and clear, a presence surfacing from behind the glass. I used to have a workshop, Gordon said, not in the even voice. In a voice from somewhere further back, coming from under the surface. I made furniture, real pieces. I had things everywhere in various stages. A long pause. I don't know why I stopped. Gordon, Kale said carefully, did you choose to stop, or did it go away on its own after you spent time at the Institute? The affect closed back over it almost immediately, but for 4 seconds it had been absent, and what was underneath was someone specific and real, and still there, still present, still waiting. I should get back, Gordon said. Lena will want breakfast. He walked away. Kale stood on the path in the early light and understood two things simultaneously. The program could be disrupted, even temporarily, by access to the right specific personal memories. And that window narrowed with time. He went home and found Sarah at the kitchen table with Mira Voss. Voss was dressed precisely, her white hair exact, her expression calibrated to the specific warmth that long practice makes genuinely convincing. There was tea on the table and the ambient quality of a pleasant, casual, spontaneous visit that Kale recognized immediately as something that had been arranged. He sat down. He smiled with equivalent warmth and matched her pleasantness with his own pleasantness, and behind all of it, he took her measure the way he'd once taken the measure of negotiators and war room strategists and the faces of people who were choosing their words with precision. Because the real meaning was located elsewhere. She was warning him, graciously, warmly, over tea, but warning. He wondered what Sarah had told her. He wondered how much she'd said innocently about his investigations. He filed the question and held his expression steady. After she left, Sarah looked at him. She seems genuinely nice. She's very capable, he said. What did you tell her about what I've been working on? A small pause. Just that you'd been researching the community, finding it interesting. She looked at him. Was that a problem? He looked at his wife and made the decision that had been approaching since their first day on the arrival platform. He told her everything. Not the careful, hedged version he'd been protecting her from. The full architecture, the neurological documentation, the prior zone programs, Gordon's voice on the perimeter path, the timeline, the data crystal. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. Sarah sat with it for a moment, going still in her specific way, not rigid, but like water that has stopped moving to find its level. Then she said, "How long have you known the full picture?" "About 10 days. The sense that something was wrong. Since the arrival platform. Why didn't you tell me earlier?" He chose his words honestly. "I was afraid you'd think I was finding problems, because I expected to find problems." She was quiet again. Then, "I have a graduate degree and 17 years of professional experience, and I have been living in a suspicious community for 3 weeks. I am not someone who requires protection from information about the place where I live." A pause. "Don't do that again." "I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Fix it." She reached across and took the data crystal from where he'd been turning it in his fingers without realizing he was doing it. What do we need? He thought of Wren, of Gordon's voice, of Dr. Braille's 3 years of patient documentation. Wren is the key, he said. If he enters the full program, we lose him, or enough of him that what comes back won't be the same. I need to reach him before that, and I need something specific enough to reach past what they've already done. The compositions, his actual work, the things that are specifically and only him. The recording you have, Sarah said immediately. Yes. And then we need to get out of this zone before Voss decides we're a problem she needs to solve. She reached into her jacket and produced a secondary data storage unit, compact, well-shielded. Dara told me 3 things this week, while trying to guide me toward a consultation at the Institute. She told me more than she intended to. I recorded all of it. With her general consent, she agreed to the conversation being recorded. I didn't specify what I intended to do with it. He stared at her. The person I was before I got tired, she said calmly, was also an investigative documentarian. Visual rather than written, but the methodology transfers. I have been watching this play since the 3rd day. I chose not to tell you until I had something worth telling. She set the drive on the table between them. I believe I now have something worth telling. There was a very long moment. I married someone considerably smarter than me, he said. Probably more than once, she said. They went to Wren the next morning, early, before Lena was up. He answered the door with the pleasant, managed affect of the past 3 weeks, and Kale looked him in the face and said quietly, Ren, I have your composition. The third movement section, the one with the copper note theme. I want you to hear it, and then I have some things to show you. And then we're going to talk about what happens next. Something moved in Ren's face that he could not prevent. Not dramatic. A stillness different from the managed kind. The stillness of a person encountering something that belongs specifically to them and cannot be replicated by anything that isn't it. Come in, he said. They sat in the living room, which was unrecognizable from Kale's first visit, redecorated in the smooth, comfortable neighborhood aesthetic, everything chosen to match, everything exactly where someone's precise and definitive idea had decided it belonged. Kale played the recording through the room's sound system. 20 minutes of layered composition, unfinished, raw in the places the finishing hadn't yet reached. He watched Ren. It was like watching someone surface from depth. Not a single dramatic gasped moment. Gradual, increment by increment, the way a tide comes in rather than the way a wave breaks. First the body, which shifted from the managed stillness into something less calculated, a leg crossing, a hand coming to the jaw in the specific way of someone who thinks with their hands. Then the eyes, which began tracking the sound with the focus, following attention of someone who makes music and is listening for where it wants to go. Then the face, which moved through dozens of small successive expressions in the space of 2 minutes, each one a small evidence of an interior life that was intact and present and had been present the entire time, waiting. Halfway through, Ren said very quietly, I didn't finish the resolution. You told me you hadn't worked it out yet, Kale said. I know how it goes now. I've known for weeks. He stopped, restarted. He stopped again. Something was happening in real time that he was processing carefully. It was there. It was always there. I just couldn't. He shook his head. Something was in the way. I know, Kale said. I know. They showed him the documentation then. Kale walked him through it the way he'd built it, not to overwhelm, but to show the full landscape from the high ground before having to walk through it. Fact by fact, source by source. Ren sat with the neurological comparisons for a long time. He read the consent documents. He looked at the before and after profiles of men in the full program, and looked at them with the expression of someone who is being shown something they need to understand and is giving it the full, serious attention it deserves. When he spoke, his voice had aged slightly from the managed version. Lena doesn't know all of this, he said. She thought she was sending me somewhere that would actually help. She was trying to help. I believe that. She's not knowingly part of it. Most of the women here aren't, I think. Some came specifically because they wanted what the program produces and understood exactly what that was. But most of them were given a partial truth and made decisions based on that partial truth. They were worked on too, just differently. Ren looked at his hands. The hands that built furniture and wrote music and dropped seedlings off porch railings and gesticulated when he was explaining something he cared about. What do? We leave today if we can. We take everything to the collective's independent review authority. They have the jurisdictional standing to conduct a formal investigation, and with the documented pattern of prior zone programs, we can make a case for immediate intervention. We don't wait. We go now. Lena. We bring her, Sarah said from the doorway. She'd been standing there for several minutes. We tell her everything you know, and then we let her make a real choice. A real one, with all the information. Not a choice someone else designed for her. Lena was in the kitchen, and she listened to everything they told her, with the stillness of a person, giving something their complete and unguarded attention. It was different from every other stillness in this neighborhood. This one was genuine. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Ren. Not the managed version, the actual one, sitting at her kitchen table, looking back at her with the simple, uncomplicated directness of someone who was simply present, simply himself. I thought you needed to be fixed, she said, not as an excuse, as a statement of fact that needed to exist. I know. I thought the hard parts of you were the problem parts. I know. You didn't know what they were doing. She was quiet again. Then she looked at her hands, the copper sculpture. I told you to take it down because of the neighbors, but that wasn't the whole reason. She paused. I just didn't understand why you needed it. You don't have to understand why I need things, he said. You just have to not take them. Another silence, then, tell me what to pack, and we'll go. They left in 2 vehicles at mid-morning. Dr. Braille was waiting at the Eastern Perimeter maintenance access with a case of documentation and the expression of someone who had been waiting longer than this particular morning. Kale had the zone's alert status partial access that she'd provided weeks ago and checked it on the drive out. Standard. They had a window. Voss will know within the hour, Dr. Braille said, getting into the vehicle. She has a residential departure monitor on any of the first 6 months. We need to be past the boundary before she triggers the lockdown protocol. She has a lockdown protocol, filed as an emergency safety measure. Standard language, very defensible in isolation. It lets her seal access points and request a community safety review before residents can be subjected to her language, external inflammatory influences. A pause. In practice, it means she can hold people here while she makes calls to sympathetic collective administrators who will slow any external review to a geological pace. She has to confirm we're actually leaving before she uses it, Kale said. Otherwise, she creates a paper trail she'd rather not have. Yes. Then she needs to be certain we're heading for the boundary before we actually are. What followed was 20 minutes of improvised theater. Dr. Braille's vehicle went the direct route to the boundary, maximum visibility, easily tracked by the zone's perimeter monitors. Kale, Sarah, Ren, and Lena took the maintenance road to the community's secondary relay station, which Dr. Braille had told him was the zone's independent outbound communications hub. It transmitted to the collective's regional network directly, outside the main community systems. The plan required 3 things simultaneously. Voss to trigger the lockdown believing she was closing a door. Dr. Braille's vehicle to reach the boundary before the lockdown completed. And KL to reach the relay station and transmit the full documentation package before anyone realized what he was doing. The relay station was unattended. KL was inside in 40 seconds with Dr. Braille's access authorization. The transmission was queued in another 2 minutes. A full compressed package containing the neurological documentation, the consent form analysis, the prior zone records, the testimonial recordings including Dara's conversation with Sarah, and a precisely written covering report that Kale had been constructing in his head for 3 days and now wrote from memory in 11 minutes. He addressed it to the Collective Independent Review Authority, the Intersettled Zone Human Rights Directorate, and 6 independent journalism organizations, including his former employer, whose editor he trusted completely and had already contacted via encrypted channel the previous evening. Mira Voss arrived with 2 community compliance officers at the 13-minute mark. She stood in the doorway in the morning light, impeccable, composed with the specific composure of someone who has prepared for every contingency and is now executing their prepared response to this one. Not angry, something more precise than anger. Mr. Davin, she said, I think you have badly misunderstood what we're doing here. He turned from the terminal. He'd hit send 40 seconds before she walked in. He kept his face steady. Tell me how. The people in this community are better than they were. Their marriages are stable. Their lives are peaceful. The men who come through the Institute are gone, he said. The specific people they were, the compositions, the workshops, the rough edges, the passionate preoccupations. Those are gone. Not treated. Erased, that is not medicine. That is revision without consent. Human difficulty, she said, with the patient conviction of a genuine true believer, is suffering. Alleviating suffering is the fundamental project of any ethical social framework. That argument, he said, can be used to justify removing any part of a person you decide is inconvenient. It has been, throughout history, by people who were also absolutely certain they were alleviating suffering. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Something moved in her face that was smaller than everything else she'd expressed. I have done good here, she said, and it came out differently from everything else, smaller, more actual, carrying a weight that hadn't been in the other words. I think you believe that, he said. I think it might even be partly true, in the ways that don't require the erasure. He looked at her directly, and it doesn't change what else is true. The lockdown had been activated. The transmission had already gone. The review authority's response came within 6 hours, indicating the documentation had landed on desks that had been waiting for exactly this kind of corroborated, comprehensive, multi-sourced evidence package. An investigative directive was issued. The Institute's treatment program was immediately suspended pending independent review. The lockdown was overridden by the regional oversight administrator, who found the activation of residential containment in response to documentation submission to be a position she was not interested in defending before a formal inquiry. 19 other residential zones were flagged for review. Dr. Braille was formally recognized as a protected whistleblower, giving her the regulatory standing needed to testify without professional risk. Voss was placed under voluntary administrative review. Ren and Lena sat in the transit station waiting area while all of this was in motion. Ren with his head back and his eyes closed, tired in the specific way that means actually recovering. Lena beside him, her hand over his, her eyes open and her expression doing the careful work of understanding what came after a morning like this one. I didn't know, Lena said to Kale at one point, not as an excuse, as a fact that needed to exist in the record. I know you didn't. I thought he was struggling and I wanted to help, and the way that was offered seemed. She stopped. It seemed designed to seem reasonable. It was designed to seem reasonable, Kale said. That was part of the design. She nodded once, slowly. Then she turned back to Ren. They released the full statement 3 days later. Kale and Dr. Braille together, published simultaneously by 7 organizations. Kale wrote it in the style he'd spent 20 years developing. The style that trusted facts to carry their own weight and didn't dress them in. Rhetoric. Because facts that needed to be dressed up usually weren't good enough to stand on their own. He wrote it in one long session at the desk in their Saranath house, which he was beginning to understand they would stay in for a while yet, because there was still work to do here. The collective's preliminary findings confirmed the core claims. In the administrative press release, a sentence read, "Questions have been raised regarding the application of behavioral optimization frameworks developed for non-human species in contexts involving human settler populations and the relevant consent and autonomy standards applicable in such contexts." He read it twice, set down his reader, looked out the window. The street that had been too perfect was changing. Gradually, incrementally, the enforced uniformity giving way in small places as people resumed, cautiously, with the careful quality of people who aren't yet sure how much space they're allowed. The minor individual expressions they'd been smoothing over. Gordon Hayes' garage door was open. He was in there, not doing woodwork yet. Some things taken don't come back all at once, and some of what the program had done was still being assessed, which was its own grief and its own long reckoning. But he was in the garage with the door open, and the sounds coming from it were not the sounds of managed contentment. They were the sounds of someone trying to figure out what they still had. Someone honestly in process. Ren's mismatched chairs were back on the porch. The copper sculpture was irreparable, damaged when it had been removed. But something new was taking shape in the evenings, pieces of things that didn't obviously belong together, being made into something that didn't have a name yet, which was exactly how Ren's work had always operated. He'd told Kale the first week, "I don't usually know what something is until I find out what it isn't." Sarah came and stood in the doorway behind him. She had her coffee in both hands the way she always held it in the mornings, and he could feel her looking at the same things he was looking at. "Are we staying?" she asked. He thought about the 19 flagged zones, about Dr. Braille needing support through the review process, about Gordon's open garage door and Ren's unnamed new project, and the 23 other men in Sepharnath who had been through various stages of the HOP program and were now in the complicated, uncertain territory of not quite knowing who they still were, trying to figure out the boundary between what had been done to them and what they actually were. "For a while," he said, "there's still work here." She made a sound of agreement and went back inside, and he listened to these ordinary sounds of her moving around the kitchen and thought about the collective's word for humans, salvageable, correctable, the word for a machine not at optimal capacity. He thought, they have been measuring the wrong thing this entire time. A machine at optimal capacity produces exactly what it was designed to produce. Every time. Without variation, without surprise, without deviation, without the small and large irregularities that come from having genuine interior life. Its value is its predictability. Its perfection is also its absolute limitation. In advance, everything it will ever do. There is no composition it is working out at 2 in the morning because the resolution hasn't declared itself yet. There is no workshop it returns to daily because there is something in the material it hasn't yet finished saying. There is no gap between its capabilities and its output because it produces precisely and only what it was designed to produce. What humans produced, when nothing had been applied to remove their capacity for production, was nothing like that. It was messy and self-contradictory and frequently wrong and sometimes destructive, and it happened in the middle of the night and in the margins of projects that were supposed to be about something else, and in the specific, difficult, unrepeatable shape of people who were exactly and only themselves. It was compositions that didn't have finished resolutions because the composer was still working out where the sound wanted to go. It was copper wire sculptures with no practical function and a specific, undeniable beauty. It was a man who swore creatively when he dropped his seedlings and laughed with the full sound of himself. It was a woman who had quietly built a parallel investigation because she trusted her own eyes and didn't need permission to use them. It was a novelist who'd come to this perfect town, looking for quiet, and found instead that he still had things to say. You could suppress this. You could confuse it. You could apply sufficient pressure that a person became genuinely uncertain whether their difficult parts were assets or liabilities, and in that uncertainty, consented to having them managed. But somewhere in there, the composition was still working itself out. The workshop was still full of unfinished things. The copper wire was in a box somewhere, and sooner or later, someone would find the box and know exactly what to do with it. This was not heroism. It was not especially brave or noble. It was a species-level stubbornness about the right to be specifically, irreducibly themselves. A stubbornness that had caused them enormous trouble throughout their history and would continue to cause trouble in the future because there would always be institutions and systems and very well-intentioned frameworks that would look at that stubbornness and see it malfunction to be corrected rather than the point of the whole enterprise, which meant there would always be work to do. The particular work of finding the places where the correction was happening, naming it clearly, and making enough noise that it couldn't be quietly buried. He turned back to his desk and opened a new document. He wrote at the top of it for a while, trying different formulations, deleting each one, trying again. The right opening was always the hardest thing. The right opening had to do the work of a door, had to give you the specific, concrete reason to keep going, had to tell you in one sentence what kind of room you were walking into and why it was worth entering. He found it on the fourth try. He kept going. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping, and when Sarah called him for breakfast, he came to the table with ink on his left hand from where he'd been writing margin notes in the old paper and penway he'd done since he was 23, and she looked at his hand and raised an eyebrow. "How's it going?" "It's going," he said. She passed him toast. He took it. Outside, the street that had been too perfect was in the slow process of becoming something more interesting, more specific, less curated, the kind of place where people were visibly working out who they actually were in the space between what they'd been and what they were going to be next. The collective would learn, or it would keep making variations of the same mistake in new configurations, which was also a very human thing to watch an alien institution do. Either way, the humans in its settlements were not going to cooperate with being corrected. They were going to keep being exactly what they were. Difficult, stubbornly particular, constitutionally resistant to optimization, and deeply, irremediably, specifically themselves. This was not a flaw. This was not a malfunction. This was not a problem to be solved or a capacity to be reduced or a deviation to be corrected. It was, as Kale wrote in the document, that would eventually reach more people than anything else he'd ever written, in the sentence that would be repeated back to him for years, in places he had no way of predicting, not a flaw at all. It was the whole point. Outside Gordon's garage was still open. Something was being made in there, slowly, in the way that things are made by someone who is relearning that they know how to make things, imperfect and real, and moving towards something it would eventually become. He wrote for 3 hours that first morning and filled 11 pages and printed them at the small desk unit in the corner of the room that he'd moved. There on their second day, back when Saranath was still just a new place and not yet a story. He read the pages standing up, the way he always read his own first drafts, because sitting down with them made him too comfortable, and comfortable reading found too little wrong. He marked 7 places with a red stylus and went back to the desk and fixed 4 of them and decided the other 3 were right and he'd been wrong. To doubt them. Then he made more coffee and thought about the 19 zones. That was the number that kept him in Saranath for now. 19 other residential communities in the collective's administered network that had been flagged by the Review Authority's preliminary findings as having organizational connections to Voss's committee and to the same treatment architecture. 19 other places where right now, people were being offered a version of themselves that was more convenient for everyone around them, and some of those people were taking it, and some of them were being given it without being asked. And all of them deserved someone to go look at what was actually there and write honestly about what they found. He thought about the versions of himself that had come before this one. The war correspondent version, 23, and convinced that proximity to danger was the same thing as understanding it. The post-conflict version, 28, and trying to write about trauma in ways that were accurate without being sextractive and getting it wrong more often than right. The mid-career version at 35, who'd found a particular kind of clarity in long-form documentary work and had been writing that clarity for 5 years without asking whether it was still the right vehicle for what he was trying to say. The exhausted, arriving in Saranath version at 41, who'd been running on fumes and self-criticism and the vague, unexamined conviction that the best of what he could do was behind him. He did not think this anymore. Something had shifted in the relay station with the data crystal warm in his fist and Voss in the doorway and the transmission already sent. Something had settled. Not confidence exactly. He'd always been intermittently confident, and that wasn't the thing that had been missing. What had settled was simpler than confidence. It was the knowledge of what he was for, not in a grandiose sense. Not in the sense of having been chosen or destined or positioned by fate at the center of anything. Just in the plain, practical sense of knowing the shape of the work and knowing he was suited to it and knowing there was more of it to do. He was suited to the work of going to look at things and writing honestly about what he found there. There was more of it to do. That was enough. The review authority's full preliminary report was released 42 days after the initial investigative directive. Kale read it in 3 sittings over 2 days, making notes in the margins of the printed copy in the old way, building a secondary document of the things the official report said, and the things it implied, and the things it conspicuously did not say, and the gap between those 3 categories, which was, as always, where the real story lived. The report confirmed the neurological modification protocols. It confirmed the consent framework deficiencies. It confirmed the pattern across the prior zone programs. It confirmed that the treatment architecture had been adapted from non-human optimization protocols without the specific consent and autonomy, safeguards that human settler populations were entitled to under the collective's own founding charter, a fact that certain sections of the collective's administrative apparatus had been aware of and had chosen, for a period of approximately 8 years, to not act upon. That last part was the most important part. That was the part that made the story not about one idealistic and misguided coordinator in one residential zone. That was the part that made it about what happens when institutions decide, at some level of their hierarchy, that the friction of obtaining genuine consent is less important than the efficiency of a desired outcome. That happened everywhere. It happened in different forms, in different contexts, but the essential structure was always the same. Someone in a position of authority decides what the correct outcome is, someone else designs a mechanism to produce that outcome, and somewhere in the architecture, the question of whether the people experiencing the outcome were actually asked gets simplified into a consent form that technically satisfies the procedural requirement without functionally doing the thing the requirement was designed to do. He'd written about this before, in different contexts. He could write about it again, and he would, and this time he had the specific, well-documented, fully sourced Saranath case as the concrete through line that gave the abstract argument a set of faces and a location and a timeline. He was working on this when Wren knocked on his door on a Thursday afternoon carrying 2 cups of tea and the expression of someone who had something to say and had been deciding whether to say it. "Come in," Kale said. He moved 3 research documents off the second chair, and Wren sat down with both cups and held one out. "The composition," Wren said. "I've been working on it again." Kale waited. "The resolution. The part I said I knew how it went, in your living room that morning." Wren wrapped both hands around his cup. "It turned out I was wrong about how it went. Or partly wrong. The version I had in my head wasn't the right version. The right version was different." He paused. "Better, I think. But I couldn't have found the better version without the wrong version first. And I couldn't have had the wrong version if I hadn't been in this place. Going through what I went through." A long pause. "I'm not saying what happened here was good. I'm not saying that. I know you're not. I'm saying that the composition that came out of it is different from what it would have been, and I don't entirely know yet if different means worse." He looked at the cup in his hands. "I thought you'd find that interesting. For your work." Kale did find it interesting. He found it more than interesting. He sat with it for a moment, turning it over. "The human capacity," he said eventually, "to take something done to you without your consent and find in it something worth using. To not be defeated by the thing that was supposed to defeat you. Is that what I'm doing?" "I think so. I think that might be exactly what you're doing." Wren was quiet for a moment. "Lena played the original recording," he said. "The 20-minute one you had. She cried for about 40 minutes afterward. Not sad crying, the other kind." Another pause. "She didn't know who I was. Not really. I didn't let her know. I didn't know how to let her know. And then the Institute was doing the thing it was doing, and then everything went the way it went." He looked up. "We're having to start over in some ways. Not from nothing, but from much earlier than we were. How is that going?" "Slowly," he said honestly. "Which is new." Something that was almost the old laugh, the bird-startling one. came into his voice briefly. She told me last night she doesn't understand the copper wire work, never has, probably never will, but she was wrong to treat her not understanding as a reason to remove it. And then she asked me to explain it to her. And I talked for 45 minutes, and she fell asleep around at 30, but she was listening until then. He shook his head. It's something. It's something, Kale agreed. They drank their tea in the comfortable near silence of two people who didn't need to fill every pause. Outside, the street conducted its afternoon business, which looked increasingly like the business of a real place inhabited by real people rather than a controlled demonstration of what a place was supposed to look like. Mrs. Alton from 2 houses down was arguing with the automated gardening system about the placement of a new planting, and she was losing the argument technically, but clearly had no intention of accepting the loss. Gordon had his garage door open again, and the sounds coming from it were different today, more purposeful, the sounds of someone who had remembered a thing and was in the process of testing whether they remembered it correctly. 3 houses up, a teenager was doing something on the front step with what appeared to be a portable music instrument that produced notes in a scale that didn't belong to any Earth tradition, and none of the adults passing by had asked her to stop. Small things. The kinds of small things that in aggregate constituted a place becoming what a place is supposed to be. The formal investigation took 8 months. During those 8 months, Kale filed 4 supplementary documentation packages with the review authority, each one addressing specific points that the authority's internal review team flagged for additional sourcing. He wrote 2 long-form pieces for the Intersettled Affairs Journal. Not the mid-tier one that had told him to soften his editorial posture, but a different one that had contacted him 3 days after the initial statement was published with the specific excitement of editors who have been waiting for this exact kind of story to land on their desks. He co-authored a technical analysis of the consent framework deficiencies with Dr. Braille, which was published in a collective administrative policy journal and generated, Braille told him with quiet satisfaction, a level of official discomfort that was visible from a significant distance. 7 of the 19 flagged zones had their treatment programs suspended within the first 90 days. 4 more followed by the end of the 6th month. The remaining 8 were under various stages of ongoing review, complicated by local administrative structures and the particular talent that large bureaucratic systems have for slowing processes they find inconvenient without actually preventing them. Voss's administrative review concluded without criminal findings, but with a formal determination that the Institute's treatment program had operated outside the consent and autonomy standards required by the collective's Human Settler Charter. The Institute was permanently closed. Its treatment protocols were formally prohibited from use in any collective-administered human residential zone. The neurological modification technology it had employed was classified as requiring explicit, fully informed individual consent under conditions free of coercion before any application to human subjects. None of this undid what had been done to the men of Saranath. That was the grief that stayed. Some of what the program had taken came back, not in the ways that made for clean narrative resolution, not all at once, not in the dramatic form of people returning fully to the versions of themselves they'd been before. It came back in the uneven, partial, ongoing way of recovery that doesn't look like recovery in any single moment, but looks like it when you compare moments across enough months. Was building again. Not at the same level he'd been before, some precision was gone, some of the intuitive architectural sense that had characterized his work. But he was building, and he was finding, as he built, that the act of building was itself part of what came back, because the capacity lived partly in the doing, and was reconstituted by the doing, and finished the composition. He performed it once, privately, in the community hall, for a small audience that included Lena, and KL, and Sarah, and Dr. Braille, and about 20 other Saranath residents who had asked to hear it. It ran 47 minutes. It was not what the original would have been, and it was something better in specific ways and worse in others, and it was specifically irreducibly what it was, which was a piece of music that could only have been made by exactly this person in exactly these circumstances, carrying the full weight of what had happened and not trying to resolve it into something simpler. After, in the community hall's quiet, Ren sat at the front of the room, and Lena came to sit beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the not saying anything had a quality that had not been present in any of their silences for the past year. It had the quality of two people who know each other. Kale walked home with Sarah in the night air. The flowering plants along the street still produced their jasmine mineral water smell. The moon of Saranath was high and clear, Their footsteps were the only sound. "Are you ready to leave?" Sarah asked. He thought about it honestly. "Nearly," he said. "When the review is finalized, when I know Dr. Braille has what she needs to continue without us here." And then he thought about the 19 zones, about the 12 that still had open reviews, about the adjacent questions the investigation had opened up, the broader question of how collective optimization frameworks were being applied in other human contexts, other forms of the same fundamental structure that didn't always look like what had happened in Saranath. "Then we go look at the next thing," he said. She took his hand as they walked. The street was quiet in the good way, the way that meant people were home and resting and living their specific, difficult, irreducible lives. "You know," she said, "I was actually tired when we came here, genuinely. I wasn't wrong that I needed rest. I know. I got it. Not the way I expected, but I got it." She was quiet for a moment. "I think we're better than we were, in some of the ways that matter." He thought about the missing laugh, the one he'd been chasing. He thought about it and then realized, with the small, quiet certainty of something finally becoming clear, that it hadn't gone anywhere. It had been there the whole time. He'd just been too far inside his own, failing to be able to hear it. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Above them, the Sarasath moon held its position in the clear sky, indifferent to the small, important things happening beneath it. The stars that surrounded it were the stars of Quadrant 7, different configurations than the ones he'd grown up with, familiar now in the way that things become familiar when you've spent enough time with them in difficult circumstances. He'd write about all of this. He was already writing about all of this. In the back of his mind, in the continuous low-level way that the writing always operated, sorting and selecting and finding the language for things that didn't yet have language, the specific weight of this place, the way it had looked from outside and what it had turned out to be inside, what it had cost and what it had found. He would write about the collective's word for humans, about what the word got wrong, about the specific, documented, evidenced ways in which the attempt to make humans optimal had collided with the thing humans fundamentally were, and about what had happened next, which was not what the people doing the optimizing had predicted. He would write about Gordon's garage door and Wren's finished composition, and the teenager's unrecognized music scale, and the 47 other small evidences he had collected over 8 months in this place of what humans did when you gave them back the room to do it. He would write, as he always wrote, about what he found when he went and looked. The collective would read it, or it wouldn't. It would learn from it, or it would file the learning in a drawer and continue making variations on the same mistake. Either way, he would have done what he could do, and the record would exist, and that was the best available answer to the question of why you bothered. He walked home with his wife in the night air of a moon colony that was in the process of becoming a real place, and thought about nothing in particular, and was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely, specifically, irreducibly fine. The collective's investigation team arrived in Saranath on the 22nd day. There were 4 of them, 2 humans, both experienced regulatory auditors from the Review Authority's Field Operations Division, and 2 collective non-human officials whose species Hale didn't recognize, but who moved with the deliberate, careful quality of entities that were accustomed to environments not built for them and had long since made their peace with adjustment. They were all 4 of them professional in the particular way of people who spend their careers walking into situations that other people have created and being required to assess those situations without having created them, which produces a specific kind of careful neutrality that is different from indifference. The lead auditor was a woman named Vrel, who had the compact, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and found the work valuable without being required to find it dramatic. She introduced herself to Cale and Dr. Braille on the first morning and asked specific, precise questions, and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who was already building a mental structure and needed these particular pieces to complete specific sections. "The documentation you provided," she said to KL during their second meeting, "is the most comprehensively organized whistleblower package we've processed in 4 years." She said this without particular warmth, as a statement of professional fact. Whatever else this investigation concludes, the quality of the sourcing is not going to be a point of contention. He thanked her and she moved on to the next item on her agenda, and he realized that was the closest thing to a compliment she was going to offer, and it was enough. The collective officials were harder to read. They spoke infrequently, and when they did, it was in the measured, multi-layered way of species for whom communication carried significantly more freight than humans generally loaded onto it. Where a human might say a sentence They said something that had the functional length of a sentence, but contained several simultaneously operating registers of meaning that required context to fully parse. Kale spent several evenings during the investigation's first week trying to accurately transcribe and annotate two of their statements for his records, and the process taught him things about the gap between collective and human communication architecture that he found immediately useful for the larger piece he was writing. He asked one of them, on the third day, whether the collective had a framework for understanding human consent that was distinct from its general consent frameworks for other species. The official was quiet for a moment. Then it said something that the translation unit rendered as, the general framework was assumed to be transferable. The error was the assumption. He wrote that down, Doctor. Braille was interviewed for 11 hours across 3 days. She testified with the methodical, evidence-grounded clarity of someone who had been building toward this testimony for 3 years and had organized everything accordingly. Kale sat in on the second session as a supporting witness and watched her walk the investigation team through the neurological documentation with the patience of someone explaining something important to people who needed to understand it rather than simply know about it. She was good at this, better probably than she knew. After the final session, when the team had broken for the day and she was packing her documentation cases in the testimony room, she said to Kale without looking up, I've been thinking about what happens after the investigation, after Saranath, after all of this. She closed a case and straightened up. I've been offered a position with the Review Authority, research consultancy focused on consent framework development for non-human to human adapted protocols. She paused. It would mean leaving Saranath. Are you going to take it? She looked at him with the scientist's eyes, the ones that were always quietly processing. The work I can do inside the system is more valuable than the work I can do criticizing the system from outside it, even if being inside it is less comfortable. A pause. What do you think? I think that calculation is correct, he said, and I think you should take it. And I think you're going to make the people in those offices very uncomfortable on a regular basis, and they need that. She almost smiled. Yes, she said. I imagine they do. The day the investigation team departed, Miravos requested a meeting with Kale. He went. He thought about not going, and then thought that refusing was a kind of cowardice he didn't want to be guilty of, and went. She met him at the community center in the afternoon, in a small room off the main hall. She was still dressed precisely, but something in the precision had changed. It had the quality now of a habit, rather than an armor, the vestige of a self-presentation that had been built for a role she was no longer quite occupying. She was, he thought, genuinely smaller than she'd have been in October, not physically, something else. I wanted to tell you, she said, that I've spent the past 8 months reading everything you've published, about Saranath, about the broader context. She folded her hands on the table. I've found it accurate, including the parts that were most difficult to read. He waited. I'm not going to try to defend the program to you. I've made my arguments in the investigation, and they were heard and found insufficient, and I've spent enough time thinking about why they were insufficient that I'm not interested in rehearsing them further. She looked at him directly. What I wanted to say was this. I came to this work because I believed that the difficulty of people's lives was reducible, that suffering was a problem with a technical solution, that the goal of a well-ordered community was the elimination of unnecessary pain. She paused. I still believe that suffering is reducible. I believe that social architecture matters, and that design can improve lives. I believe that. Another pause. What I failed to adequately account for was who gets to decide what counts as unnecessary. He sat with this for a moment. And now I think the question of who decides is the fundamental question, not the subsidiary one. She looked at the table. I think I've spent a significant portion of my professional life doing good work with a critical error embedded in the foundation of it. What happens to you, he asked, not with hostility. Genuinely, I'm returning to research, non-applied. The kind where you find things out and publish them, and don't get to decide what anyone does with what you've found. Something that might have been a rueful acknowledgement moved across her face. I think that's probably where I should have stayed. He thought about the thing she'd built here and about what it would have been if the fundamental question had been answered differently at the start. A genuine improvement in something. The actual hard work of designing social architecture that served people. All of that capability, that genuine intelligence and organizational skill, deployed with a different fake premise. The work you were trying to do, he said carefully, was real work. The problem wasn't the goal, it was the methodology. The methodology, she said, Was the assumption that I knew better than the people I was affecting what they needed. Yes, that's a remarkably common error, she said. It is, he agreed. That's part of why I write about it. They sat in the quiet room for another few minutes without saying much of importance. And then he stood up, and she stood up, and they shook hands in the formal way of two people who were not going to be friends but who had arrived, the end of something, at a mutual acknowledgement that was something. He walked home through the afternoon light of a Saranath that was in the middle of being what it was going to be next. The investigation would conclude. The report would be published. The zones would be reviewed one by one, and some of them would be harder than others, and none of it would be fast enough for the people who had been affected, and all of it was still better than the alternative of it not happening. He would write about all of it, and the writing would be what it always was, inadequate in some proportion to the thing it was trying to describe, and still necessary, and still the best he could do. He thought about the word again, correctable, salvageable. He thought about what it would mean to be a species that was not correctable, not in the way the collective meant, not because you were beyond correction. He had no illusions about human perfectibility, had spent 20 years documenting with some specificity the many ways humans were perfectly capable of going wrong. But because correction, in the sense the collective meant it, assumed a fixed endpoint, an optimal state, a specific and definable version of what the thing was supposed to be, against which the current version could be measured for deviation. Humans had no fixed endpoint. That was the thing. That was the specific feature of the species that the collective kept running into and failing to account for. The endpoint kept moving because people were always in the process of finding out what they were, and that process didn't conclude, and any attempt to conclude, it artificially produced something that was not a person but a specific static snapshot of what a person had been at one moment. You couldn't optimize a thing that was always in the process of becoming something else. You could only try to walk alongside it and get out of the way when it needed room and pay attention to where it seemed to be going and write about what you observed in the hope that the observation was useful to someone. He thought that was probably a reasonable description of what it meant to do the work he was suited for. He kept walking. There was a moment, about 6 months into the investigation, that Cale didn't write about at the time and thought about writing about later, and ultimately decided to put in the book rather than the journalism. He'd been on the perimeter path in the early morning, the walk he'd been doing since the first week, the habit that had outlasted its original investigative purpose and become just a thing he did because he found the thinking time useful, and he rounded the eastern curve and found Gordon Hayes sitting on one of the path's stone benches with a piece of wood in his hands, not working it, just holding it, a small piece, birch or something like it, pale and smooth, clearly from some project in the garage. He was sitting in the early light and holding the wood with both hands and looking at nothing in particular. Cale had almost walked past without interrupting. He'd gotten a few steps past before Gordon said, without looking up, "Do you ever think about the versions of yourself you might have been?" He stopped, turned back. "Sure," he said. "Sometimes. I've been thinking about them a lot." Gordon turned the piece of wood in his hands. "The workshop version. The one who built things. He's still in there somewhere. I can feel him." He looked up, "But he's not exactly the same as the one who's coming back now. The one who's coming back has been somewhere the other one hasn't been. And I don't know yet what that means for what gets built." Cale sat on the other end of the bench. "I keep trying to figure out," Gordon said, "whether what happened to me is a thing that happened to me, or a thing that's just part of the whole." He paused. "Whether the workshop version and the damaged version and whatever comes after are all the same person, just at different points in the thing, or whether what they did at the Institute actually broke the thread somewhere. What do you think?" Gordon was quiet for a long time. "I think I'm still having the thought," he said finally. "The damaged version is still asking the question. That seems like it should mean the thread is there." Cale thought about this. "Yeah," he said, "I think it does. I built a chair last week." Gordon said, "Small one. For the corner of the study. It's not what I would have built before. The joinery is different. Different instincts about where the weight should go." He looked at the piece of wood in his hands. "Lena sat in it for 2 hours reading. Then she told me it was the most comfortable chair she'd ever sat in." He turned the wood again. "I don't know if that means something got better or just different, but I've been thinking about it." Cale had been thinking about it too, since that morning. He'd been thinking about it when he wrote the technical analysis with Dr. Braille, and when he filed the supplementary documentation, and when he sat in on the testimony sessions, and when he walked the perimeter path in the early light. The question of whether damage was purely loss or whether it was sometimes also transformation. Whether the things taken could be replaced by things made rather than things returned. Whether recovery had a shape that looked like restoration, or whether it had a different shape that was its own thing. He didn't have a clean answer to this. He wasn't sure there was one. The chair was more comfortable than it would have been before. And that was real, and the cost of the chair was also real. And those two things lived side by side without resolving into a lesson. That was the kind of thing that got harder to write the more honest you were about it. The kind of thing where the journalist's instinct was to find the conclusion, and the human instinct was to sit with the open question, and both instincts were partly right, and the work was figuring out the proportion. He wrote it as open as it was. He figured people could handle open questions if you trusted them enough to present the question clearly. The Saranath he left, 8 months after arriving, was not a perfect town anymore. It was better than that. It was a place where things were being worked out incrementally, imperfectly, by people who were in the process of figuring out what they were. The lawns were less uniform. The gardens showed more individuality. The men and women who walked the streets moved with the specific, slightly impractical quality of people who were inhabiting their actual lives. Not all of them. Some of the men were still in the slow, uncertain process of recovery, still finding the thread Gordon had described, still trying to work out what came after the experience of having parts of themselves briefly taken and then partially returned. But they were in that process, and the process was theirs, and no one was applying anything to interrupt it. The day before they left, Cale walked the neighborhood one final time, hands in pockets, the way he'd walked it at the beginning, noticing things. The gardening system was losing another argument with Mrs. Alton. 2 children were building something in the middle of the street that served no apparent practical purpose, and that their parents, visible in a nearby doorway, had decided to let continue. The teenager with the non-standard music scale was playing again on her front step, and this time an older man from 3 houses down had come to sit nearby and listen with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what they were hearing. Wren was on his porch. The mismatched chairs were there, and so was the beginning of a new copper project, different from the original, built from different materials, toward a different end. He raised a hand when he saw KL. KL raised his back. The afternoon light of Saranath fell across everything in the particular way it had always fallen, the way he would always remember it from this period, warm and low and carrying in it the specific quality of a light that had no idea what had been happening beneath it and was simply doing what light does, which is illuminate whatever is there without judgment or preference. He went home and packed, which was, as it has always been with humans, the part that made the whole enterprise worth watching.